Recording in progress.
We did the last half in during COVID over Zoom. And we had, the Sunday school class had 12, 13, 14. But at its height during COVID, it was 25, 26, 27. So there's this, they just shut down the churches. And these people, so you're sitting home on Sunday morning when all you have to do is log into your computer and click the link and you're participating in the Sunday school class. You don't even have to get out of bed. You just, so I had some of that, but that carried over after. So we did half the book of Luke during the COVID period over Zoom. Half the book of Luke, the second half of Luke, and the first 8 chapters of Acts. So it was one of the most productive Bible study periods of my life, was during the COVID thing. It was just, we had people from 3 or 4 states, a guy from Washington State, I don't know why I'm pointing that way, and
That's right, Wayne.
a couple from Florida, sometimes 2 sets down there in Florida. This guy from Canada came in sometimes, a couple from North Carolina. It was just a great experience. And so I've always Zoomed it now, mainly so I can record it. And I just now figured out that you can share the screen that the PowerPoint is running on, so you don't actually see the Zoom controls. I've been doing this for 2 years now, and I just figured this out tonight. So anyway, what I thought we'd do is talk a little bit about the Bible. If it's too obvious, you feel free to say something, but I've never found that to be true. At least I know when we start doing this that I'm not assuming, because people sit there and they listen to teaching on the gospel and they're afraid to say, what's this or that. For example, I was teaching an apologetics thing when I was on staff with Crusade. I had like 40 students in this room on Michigan State, and got to the end of it, and I had used the word apostle. And I got to the end of it, and the student, she raised her hand and she said, "What's an apostle?" And that's when I thought, oh, don't assume anything. I mean, there's no reason. Some of these people have never opened a Bible in their life. All they've ever known is maybe what they heard in church when they went, and they don't remember any of that. So don't make any assumptions. So we'll just walk through this a little bit. It'll go from the most obvious to probably the least, maybe a little more obscure, and it'll flesh out this world of the New Testament that we're going to dive into. And I'll do some more of it as we go along in Luke and Acts. And I hope that it really opens your eyes. You're being in Luke, you're dropped into the middle of this world. You don't even know that it's just simmering. When Jesus, this is previewing Luke now, when Jesus was born, the Roman Empire was only about 27 years old. Caesar had only been assassinated 27 years earlier. No, I'm sorry. When was he assassinated? 41. Augustus took over. Augustus turned it into an empire in, I think, 31. And Jesus was born in 4 BC. It's all BC. And then the Romans took control of Palestine in 6 BC, in 6 AD. And so these political currents are it's just in the air, and you see it pop up sometimes, like with the debate about the poll tax and whether it's lawful to pay the toll to Caesar. See whose image and inscription is on it. Okay, render to Caesar what is Caesar and what is God's to God's. That's not just being clever. That issue of the poll tax, they did not sit well with these Jews to have these coins that had the image of the emperor who was worshipped. And the emperor worship was a big deal. Cities like Philippi and Corinth and Ephesus and stuff like that. And so these Jews that came into Jerusalem for the festivals, they were coming from these cities. They're just steeped in pagan idolatry, including emperor worship. So they come in, and now all of a sudden you have this issue brewing. The Roman presence, including the auxiliary military in Caesarea, which we'll get to, the Syrian legate with the Roman legions, the poll tax, these revolutionary leaders every once in a while popping up, which you read about in Acts a couple of times. Judas of Galilean, for example. And it's just simmering, but you don't necessarily, it doesn't seem obvious. It seems very calm, but it's nothing about that period is calm, which is why in AD 70, 40 years after Jesus, less than 40 years after Jesus was executed, resurrected, the Romans came in and utterly annihilated Jerusalem, completely wiped it off the face of the earth. took the funds from the temple back to Rome, and in one of the great ironies of history, used it to fund the building of the Colosseum, which was one of the most haunting, brutal venues the world had ever seen. So, but anyway, all that swirling in the story of Luke and Acts, and it's just under the surface, and it pops up every once in a while. So when you understand something about what happened prior to that, you'll understand a little bit more about these Hellenistic synagogues, these these questions that are being asked of Jesus, why it's a big deal that Jesus didn't just heal the leper, why Luke bothers to say he reached out his hand and touched it, why that's a big deal. That's very, it would have been shocking to the people of the day to watch that happen. He was making a statement. It was an acted out parable. It was an acted out message. He was demonstrating the very thing that he came to bring, not just in words, but in his act. So when he touches the dead body and raises the woman's son, when they're carrying him out, he touched a dead body. Well, if you know something about Jewish tradition, that's a defiling act. And you get this clear message repeatedly in Jesus' life that uncleanness didn't transfer to him. He was the contagion transferring cleanness. But unless you know something about this, you don't pick those currents up. Or the social status, what I call the social caste system, which we'll talk a lot about. Very, very important in the Greco-Roman world, which we'll talk about. You have, these orders, this like we have first century, we have 22nd century, 21st century social distancing, 6 feet. Well, they had social distancing. If you were a Roman, you didn't speak to a slave. Slaves were, the difference between a slave and a Roman citizen, we'll talk about Roman citizen, was the difference between essentially a human and a non-human. So when you see, when you see in a church, there's going to be slaves and Romans, like there would have been in the Roman church when Paul writes that book to the Romans. That's revolutionary. That when Paul says there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, and free means Roman, nothing like what we think of as free. If you were a Roman citizen, you were free. If you weren't a Roman citizen, you were not free. You didn't have those protections. But when he says neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, it's overthrowing, it's upending this whole well-established, very formal bedrock social caste system that these people have. Not only does he overthrow it, he puts slave in front of free, right? Neither slave nor free. Paul's a Roman. So the Roman citizen denigrates himself in that passage by putting slave first. Everybody would have picked up on that. That's the advantage of doing this kind of thing. So if some of it seems obvious, just bear with me and ask questions. I'm not a historian, but I know some things, so we can talk about it as we go. So I thought we start right here. This is the Mediterranean Sea. Spent a lot of time in the Navy on that water right there. And that's today, of course, and I just wanted to situate the world as it is now, and so we can correlate it to the world that was. But our little corner of interest is right down here, of course. That's where Israel is. Of course, back then it wasn't called Israel. Israel was a nation. And Romans were not going to let Palestinians, we're not going to let Judeans of the Judean province of the Roman Empire call themselves the nation of Israel. That's inflammatory. That's incendiary right then and there. So there was no Israel in the time of Jesus, and there hadn't been since 587 BC with the second exile. We'll talk about that too. So you even see that word right there, Israel. They know that's a big deal to them. You go to those Jews that live there right now. To them that's a big deal. To us, it doesn't mean anything to know that we live in the United States of America. But if you went 2,000 years where you couldn't even say that, and then you get your nation back, it becomes a bigger deal. And so that's, even that right there, especially when you consider, as we talk about this stuff, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iran, Iraq, this is some important ones here, Lebanon, those are all openly hostile to this little thing nestled in the middle here called Israel now. And their attitude about these things is steeped in their history, and their history, they have these celebrations, Hanukkah. Why do they do this? That's remembering. That's all about remembering. We'll talk about some of that too as we go. But everything is about remembering. Their connection to the past is something Americans have no affinity for. We don't value the past, even in our own families. Like I don't know my great. My knowledge of my own family's past ends with my grandparents, and I can't tell you anything about where they grew up or anything before that. They're not like that. And these people remember their history is valuable to them as a people, as a family group, and as a nation, very valuable to them. We just don't have that connection with ours. It's part of the post-enlightenment modern world where you sever your connection to the past and you just try to produce a better future, which would have a double meaning. So okay, anyway, that was written down, so I don't know if it was useful or not. But that's the Mediterranean Sea. There's England right up here. There's someplace I can't remember. Oh, it's Ireland. There's some people in this room that like that. Yeah. Where's Cork? Cork is right down here, right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. All right. How come it's not moving? Okay, that's our little corner, and that's more like the world as it was in on the timeline that we're going to look at in a second. Because if I ask you, in what year, get within 5 years, in what year did Jesus die? Within 5 years. Does somebody want to take a shot?
33 AD-ish.
Okay, somebody has an idea about that. In what year? I already said it. We can play those games all day, but yeah, I mean that kind of thing right there. When on this timeline, that is the human experience that these events even happen. And with these students in Crusade, it could have happened in 1700s, and it could have happened in 1 million BC. It's all the same to them. They don't have any way to compare, any way to analogize from their current time. And so this is our area. You notice they put Palestine next to Israel. I think it's because they're acknowledging that Israel is a nation. Palestine is a geographical locality that corresponds to the nation of Israel sometimes, because the nation of Israel size changed some. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then there's these empires that rose and fell and then rose again in some cases around Israel and exerted more or less influence on the nation of Israel, and then afterwards on whatever peoples happened to be there when they went into exile, which we'll talk about. And so the big ones are, you'll see it on the timeline in a minute. Egypt, of course, which was early, comparatively early. Assyria, which was next, and then Babylon, which they're calling Mesopotamia here. And those roughly correspond to the nations that they've got outlined there. Persia is going to be afterward. We'll talk about all this, but those are the major empires that exerted influence, good or bad, on the nation of Israel up until the exile. All right, so here's a timeline. I love timelines. She knows that. He probably knows that. Love timelines. We're going to do this in 2 parts. Every single event that I put on this timeline is extremely significant. Every single event or person. You can put 1 million things on this, or you can say, what are the top 7, 8, 9, 10 things to put on the timeline that most affect the world of the New Testament? This is what I chose rather haphazardly. But up here, you can see the empires that rose and fell. These are very arbitrary, these beginnings and ends, except for Babylon, the end of Syria and the beginning of Babylon. And then this period in between. And you'll see in the Old Testament as you read mention of these empires. So the Israelites, of course, after the Exodus, Egypt pretty much gets left behind. It's really not true, but you don't see Egypt as a presence, as a force to contend with for Israel in Canaan, which is another name for Palestine, more anciently for Palestine. And so here's the Exodus from Israel. I got that right, yeah. Here's the, excuse me, yeah. Yeah, right here. This is all guesswork, by the way, based on some numbers that we'll get into at some point in the next number of weeks. So we start with the three patriarchs, which I'm gonna say is 2000 BC, which is pretty standard among evangelicals. Now, if you're not an evangelical and you're an atheist scholar, you're gonna say something like, I don't think Abraham even existed. But you have a lot of explaining to do. Because if Abraham didn't exist, then Isaac didn't exist. And if Isaac didn't exist, Jacob didn't exist. And if Jacob didn't exist, the 12 sons of Jacob didn't exist. So whence the 12 tribes? That's the problem that you have with that sort of thing. But you start with the great patriarch, upon which is based all Israelite identity. To be a child of Abraham was to know thyself. To not be a child of Abraham, to be a child, in other words, to be a child of Abraham was to be a Jew. And to not be a child of Abraham through Jacob was to be a Gentile, which is to say not a Jew. And that is the most fundamental distinction in humanity. Go back to caste systems. Only the caste system here is not social. Romans, senatorial order, equestrian order, Romans, women, lepers, slaves, children, they all have their place in the social caste system. We have here, with the introduction of Abraham, a spiritual caste system that defines what it means to be a son of among the people of God. So that makes Abraham, the covenant with Abraham is the chief symbol of Israel's national identity. It defines Israel as a nation, and it operates as a boundary marker around the people of God to the exclusion of not the people of God. That's the perimeter. That's the great wall around, if you will. And so that's why that is so important. And that continued on through today, I guess. That becomes an issue in Jesus' life. He's trying to talk to these people like they need to repent. And they're saying, what are you talking about? We have Abraham as our father. And then Jesus says the unthinkable. God is able to raise up, that's John the Baptist, God is able to raise up sons of Abraham from these stones. They're talking like it means nothing to be a child of Abraham, which upends their entire sense of identity as individuals and as a nation. So when Jesus says, before Abraham was born, I am, they're ready to kill him on the spot. That's the place of this man. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 sons of Jacob, who was also called Israel, where the name Israel came from, he was renamed by the angel that he wrestled with. So that's the birth of the name Israel, upon which the nation is built. And so they're going to spend, so the book of Genesis ends with, we can speed this up if you want. I don't know what people want, or we can just keep going like this.
Are we doing?
I mean, it's all me talking, so there's,
No, yeah, keep going. I think it's great.
Okay. So it's all off the cuff, but she knows I've done this. So we're going to close the book of Genesis with them in Egypt, where the Egyptians are protectors and providers because they went to Egypt because of a famine. But Joseph, of course, went to Egypt as a slave. That's the famous story of Joseph being sold into slavery. So one of the great divine ironies, Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt. And as a consequence of that horrific act, he is able to bring his entire clan to Egypt for protection against the famine that just keeps going and going. But the problem is, even though he's risen to the top, he still has technically the status of slave. And his protector, of course, is the Pharaoh. But once the Pharaoh is gone, what is his status? Oh, and also the family inherits his status. So when the Pharaoh passes on, as time goes on, that slave status reasserts itself on Joseph, and also then on the entire clan of Jacob, which is 70 or 72 or whatever. So they all become slaves. It's not like they became slaves. the second they went to Egypt, they had slave status. And so it reasserts itself during what we call this, it's a period of ignorance between when they went to Egypt and when Exodus chapter 1 opens up. It's about 400 years. It's just silent. But during that silent period, that slave status reasserted itself, and the Egyptians got very brutal about it. And so that sets this all done on purpose in the providence of God. This is how he is going to form a people for himself. He did not want these people. This is my guess. He didn't consult me. He does not want them intermarrying with the Canaanites. Good call, because of what we know is going to happen with Israel later when they get back to Canaan. It's their tendency. So he takes them someplace that's hostile, and they insulate themselves. They have this very strong identity as they circle the wagons, right? Because they're the slave people as a people, not as individuals, as an ethnic group. They're a slave people, and that tends to build your sense of national identity. And so they maintain that all the way through this period of enslavement, so that when we see it open up, they're not a nation. Open up in Exodus, they're not a nation, but they are a people with a sense of their own identity, and they're ready to come out of Egypt now as a people with a sense of their own identity. That's exactly what happens. So then you move on to the law. So now you move on to with the Exodus, which is one of the most misnamed books in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, because they didn't flee, they were expelled in a desperate attempt to save the nation of Egypt from destruction. And so they were driven out of Egypt. And it's woven in, again, these enacted ceremonies where in the Passover, the Passover is to be conducted in a way that reflects how it was instituted, because they were being expelled from Egypt in the middle of the night. Get out of here as fast as you can. So they had to eat it with their cloaks on and quickly. Nothing fancy, just bitter herbs, whatever that. Troy knows more about that than I do, but just get this down. That's the ceremony. So this Passover ceremony was probably, it ain't Christmas dinner. Christmas dinner all afternoon. No, you get up, you stand up with your all your clothes on like you're going to travel, and you consume this thing quickly so that you enact the actual Exodus in a sense every single year that you do this. So that leads to the law, which is their second great symbol of national identity. The law being the means by which you keep the covenant. The covenant is based on law keeping. The covenant was given through Moses. It's the Mosaic law or the Mosaic covenant. It's also a covenant. So you have the covenant with Abraham, then you have the covenant with Moses, which is given to regulate the people of God in their covenant, in the covenant that God made with Abraham. So it's a covenant within a covenant. And so when Jesus said, in Jeremiah, when God says, "Behold, days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel," not like the old covenant that they broke. He's talking about that covenant, this Mosaic covenant. He's not talking about the covenant with Abraham. They couldn't keep the law. They couldn't keep the Mosaic covenant. So he's going to replace it. And now when Jesus says, "This is the new covenant in my blood," everybody at the table knows what he's talking about here. It's Passover. So it's all in the air anyway, right? And everybody in the room knows it's this moment, it's this sacred moment where something magnificent, transformative is taking place, where one covenant is going out and another covenant is going in, but we remain the people of God as children of Abraham. All that was happening at the Last Supper, probably very self-consciously. So very self-consciously on Jesus' part. I'm certain there was awareness on the part of his disciples, and they're confused. What is he talking about? What on earth can he be talking about? What does it mean that this is the new covenant? What about Moses? What about the temple? You can't process the transformation of a 1400-year tradition without more help at a Passover dinner. you know, you can't do it. But anyway, so that's the second symbol, great symbol of Israel's national identity, in my view. And again, it's a boundary marker. Those who keep the law, those who are under Moses, those who submit to Moses, are the people of God. Within Moses, you have the people of God. Outside of Moses, you just have the nations. Just the mob, the masses, the unclean masses. So that's two. What time is it?
25.
Okay. So we'll do this more quickly now. So we have a conquest now under Joshua. Moses dies, for reasons we don't need to get into. Joshua becomes Moses' replacement, and they conquer the land of Canaan. Did I have a map next? They conquer the land of Canaan, which we're not going to have a good map for that. This is the wrong map. But they come up from the south like this, and they come this way, and they conquer the land of Canaan, but they do a crappy job of it. So the covenant with Abraham just was a promise of land. That's it. Go back and look at Genesis chapter 15. Genesis chapter 12, Genesis chapter 15. The land is the promise upon which the covenant with Abraham was built. So this is fulfillment, period. And so on the land, keeping the Mosaic covenant, as children of Abraham, you find the people of God. Off the land, out from under Moses, not as children of Abraham, you have the nations. What's next? It's I should have wrote this down. Temple. No, king. So now we move on a little bit farther. And we find the period of what's called the United Monarchy. So we have this awful period of the judges, which we're going to pass right over. So you get a break there. It's 400 years, probably. And we're not going to get into the details of it, but we have the establishment for the first time in Israel's history of a monarchy, of a king. Saul is first. We're going to talk about him. David is second. There's a change in lineage. Saul was a Benjamite. David is from the tribe of Judah. And you have the establishment of a dynasty. And this dynasty is so important, becomes so important to this people that it also is treated as it is one of Israel's chief symbols of national identity. So if there is no king over Israel, in what possible sense can you say that you're experiencing the blessings of the covenant with Abraham? Because God promised that a descendant of David would always be on the throne. So if it's a thousand years later, and you haven't had a king in 600 years, and you pass through the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Egyptians, and then you get into the Seleucids and the Ptolemies with the Egyptians, and now the Romans. You don't even have you have Herod, but he's under the control of the Romans. And you have Pontius Pilate in Judea. He's a Roman governor. Herod Antipas was king over Galilee, but Judea, where Jerusalem is in the temple, they had a Roman governor there. So there's no king. In what possible sense can you say you're experiencing the blessings of God under the covenant? You can't. It's that significant. So with your anointed king, the king anointed by God, on the land, they're back on the land. Maybe we'll talk about that sometime. Keeping the law of Moses, as children of Abraham, you have the people of God. Absent any one of those, and the world was not right. You just have the nations. So when the Israelites are going to get exiled down there in the 6th century, the 500s, to be off the land without a king is to just be among the nations, and that's the way it's stated in Lamentations. It's a great statement. It's straightforward. Is it Israel is out among? I gotta go find it. Israel is among the nations, and you don't think anything of it when you read it. I think it's Lamentations. It's in Lamentations of all books. Israel among the nations, and if you're one of these Israelites, then none of that makes any sense. In what sense are we the people of God if we're among the nations? We have no temple left. no sacrifices, we don't have any king, we're off the land. We're just like the nation. We're cursed by God. We're experiencing the curses of the covenant, not the blessings of the covenant. So in Deuteronomy, the curses and blessings of the covenant are listed. There's 14 verses on the blessings of the covenant. There's 54 verses on the curses of the covenant. And they got them all. 587 BC. So anyway, in between, finish this off. We have the United Kingdom, 3 kings. That's all it lasted, about 120 years. David had a son named Solomon. Solomon had a great first half. And he had a pretty good second half, but he did not set the kingdom up to continue, partly because of his own idolatry. So when he died, the kingdom partitioned into a northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, and the two southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin. The northern tribes followed a man named Jeroboam. Southern tribes acknowledged Rehoboam, who was the son of Solomon. And the north immediately collapsed into idolatry. 100%. Nothing was left of it as far as the worship of the God of Israel. So they set up we didn't get into it, but there was in Dan, there was a center of idolatry in Bethel. Is that Bethel? I don't speak Hebrew, so it's probably Bethel. Centers of idolatry in the north and south, so they can make it as easy as possible to be idolatrous, because you don't want these northerners thinking of Jerusalem as the center of worship, as the southern kingdom. The spiritual and the political are all used together. So Jeroboam has to unattach them from Jerusalem as the administrative center of the worship of the nation. And the way that he does that is he invites them. He makes it easy. If you're from the north, you can just go to Dan. You don't even go around Jerusalem. If you're from the south, you can go to Bethel. And then that's exactly what they did. And so when you look at the list of kings in First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, there is not a single king in the north that is called a good king. Every single one of them is called evil. And in the south, there are 6 out of 19 or 20 that are called good kings. But this goes on from 931 BC to 722 BC, when the Assyrians invade from the northeast, the northern kingdom of Israel, wipe it off the face of the earth, cart the survivors back to the east to be slaves. They intermingle with the native population. So at that point, basically, as an identity, as a group, the northern 10 tribes just cease to exist. And what you see in the New Testament is a place called Samaria, which is some kind of either remnant of the 10 northern tribes or just the Gentiles that happened to live there all those years, which would be why the Jews wanted nothing to do with them. At best, they were half-breed former Israelites. At worst, they were polluted Gentiles in the midst of our land. So either way, we don't have anything to do with them. And so that leaves Judea, that leaves the southern. So then what we see then is a southern exile 140 years later, when Babylon is now the empire in the ancient Near East. They invaded and destroyed the southern kingdom, destroyed the temple. By the way, I missed it. That was the 5th great symbol of national identity. We're going to go over those things sometime. That important. But they wipe it all out. It's all gone, and they cart the inhabitants back east, and that's it for Israel. That's it for a nation of Israel and a cohesive people on the land, period. And so what happened was Babylon didn't last actually that long, and right there at the end of the line, the other end of the Babylon line, the Persians will conquer the Babylonians in about 530 BC or so, maybe whatever that is, 60 years after the southern exile. And they are fairly favorable towards the Jews that they've inherited, and maybe some other people groups as well. If you conquer a kingdom, you have to decide what you're gonna do with these people. And you can make a lot of brownie points but in the way that you handle it. So they allowed the Israelites to go back and reconstitute Jerusalem, which is not the same thing as reconstituting Israel. There's no nations here. We're not playing, you're not gonna get a king. You're gonna get some kind of governor. We may let one of you govern, but you're not gonna get a king. We have one king and he's in Persia. What do they call him? King of Kings, the Persian king. It's called King of Kings. So they're allowed to come back. They rebuild the temple, that second temple. It's a shadow of the former one, but there it is. So they do have a wall around Jerusalem. They do have a temple. They can do their thing. And that goes on for hundreds of years. So that's about 500 or so BC. So now we enter the period of the exile, post-exile. And that's the period we're interested in. A lot happened in the post-exilic period. So we pick up with Babylon right here again. There's Persia, the exile of Judah, second temple. Now things happen on the green line, the green and yellow line. And this is the part. So they inherit. The Persians are going to be conquered by who? Who said that? That's how he made his name. If you wonder how a 21-year-old made his name, he conquered the greatest empire in the world before he was 23 in some absolutely spectacular military moves. And so he however loved Babylon and he loved Egypt. So there's a city built in Egypt that he built. What's the name of that city? Alexandria. The Alexandrian Lighthouse, the Alexandrian Library is this fantastic mindset of learning that the Greeks had. Alexander was schooled by Socrates. And he was Aristotle. Was it Aristotle? Who knows? You know more about this than I do? Good. So you can correct me on this. But he was in the sweet spot of the golden age of Greek philosophy. And his father was serious about it, and Alexander was serious about it. So you have this transfer, this is how I read it, of that mindset into Alexandria as well. And so even after basically his kingdom, if you even want to call it that, didn't survive him really. He started his conquest 333 BC or something like that. He died in 336. He started, and in 323 he died. And so when he was 33 years old, imagine that. And so his kingdom then, whatever you want to call it, it's the internal squabbling thing. The generals, the powers distributed, the geography got distributed with the power, with whatever the powers were. And so in Egypt, you have the Ptolemies who will continue on and rule. They're Greeks, including Cleopatra, the most famous Ptolemy, seventh, I think. Cleopatra the seventh. Cleopatra was like a title. So she was the seventh, I think. That's how it was. I can't remember. But so that happens all the way through this silent, what we think of as the silent period when there's no prophetic writings. That's all happening just right over there in Egypt and to the north in Syria, because the Seleucids also got their part of it. And so there's going to be these currents that are going to unfold in these different places, and they're fighting each other. So the Seleucids would fight the Ptolemies and so forth, and Palestine would change hands and then go back and forth. And at a certain point there, in like 164 BC, the Israelites actually got, whatever you want to call them, Judeans, whatever you want to call them, they actually got their independence. That's the Maccabean revolt. And so they get their independence for 100 years until the rise of Rome. But in the meantime, while all that's going on, even though Greece fell in a sense, Greek culture won the day. And so there was this tendency for these places to absorb all things Greek, most importantly for us, the Greek language. And so by the time the New Testament period opens up, Greek is the language of commerce. Koine Greek, common Greek. And so all of the books of the New Testament are written in Greek. So it's almost providential, just in time for these books to be written from about, let's just call it 49 BC, 49 AD till the close of the century, 95, 100, when John's books were written, I think. All of them could be written in a single language that everybody in the eastern part of the empire understood. Everybody spoke Greek. It's one of the great ironic outcomes of Alexander the Great, who couldn't care less about anything. So that process of absorbing Greek culture is called Hellenization. Hellenes is the Greek word for Greeks. And so when Rome rises to power, starting in the middle of the 2nd century BC, they become Hellenized. They absorb Greek culture as well. And so you could also call it, it's called the Roman Empire, but you could just as easily call it the Greco-Roman Empire. It's that prolific. And so the point being that in the 1st century AD, you could walk. What have I got here? That's the Roman Empire, a little after in 17 AD. So it's a little different. It's also after Judea's been destroyed, so really there is no Jerusalem to speak of. But anyway, you could walk from Egypt, I don't know what they did with Sinai, all the way around, pick up some 1st century hitchhiking on maritime transport. Actually, you don't even need to do that. You could take the Via Egnatia, the road that went from Byzantium all the way to the coast, little 40-mile ferry ride, Appian Way, the Via Appia, you get all the way to Rome and do it safely on well-engineered roads with hotels along the way and mile markers in Latin by the time of the New Testament. So that's going to be the world Paul's going to operate in as a Roman, all just in time. So we'll get back to all that later. All right, so that's Rome, and Rome will carry the day. Here's all the emperors that are mentioned in the New Testament. Yes, 2 of them by name, 3 of them by name. 1 is not by name. Anybody know which one is the odd man out? Nero. Nero's not mentioned by name. He's the Caesar. One of the great ironies of history. He's the Caesar that Paul appeals to save him from the Jews in Jerusalem. It turns out to be Nero. But anyway, Augustus was the first emperor. It is often said of Augustus that it would have been better if he'd never been born or if he'd never died, because he was a great emperor by their standards. Nobody ever equaled him. What's his name? Marcus Aurelius, maybe in the late 90s or something like that. Constantine is good too. But anyway, so Augustus and Tiberius are both mentioned in Luke. Augustus is the emperor when Jesus is born. Tiberius is the emperor during Jesus' ministry. And so you're going to see in Luke, in the 15th year, he's going to mark it, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, he's going to go through these markers of the situation on the ground. And I think it's important, if he's going to bother to record it, we should bother to figure out why these people matter. That's my view on this. And so that's the Roman Empire during Luke. Augustus and Tiberius, he's going to last longer than the period of Luke. And then during Acts, partly Tiberius, partly, there's one missing right here. Who's missing? He's not mentioned. There's one emperor missing. In a way, he's most famous one. Caligula, the bad one. Maybe why he's never mentioned. So he only gets 4 years. What's that? Nero was a bad one too, but Caligula was, there's a thing about Roman emperors. It's murder or be murdered. That's my saying for these people. They even think you might someday think about murdering them, they would kill you. And so this intrigue in the palace was extraordinary. And so Caligula's mother engaged in some shenanigans to get him to become emperor instead of another guy that I can't, not Brutus, but I forget the guy's name. But there's all these shenanigans that happen. She gets murdered. Did he murder her? Claudius might have murdered his mother. I think two of these murdered their mother, Claudius and Nero. I think both of them murdered their mothers, and their mothers were very, very conspiratorial, getting their sons to the throne. In Nero's case, his mother intended on ruling with him, and he was having none of it eventually. So eventually he had a failed attempt to kill her, and then a successful attempt to kill her. But anyway, so Caligula lasted 4 years. He was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's bodyguard. So, you know, if the bodyguard wants you dead, oh, well, you can't call the police. They're the police. So Caligula and Nero were both assassinated by the Praetorian Guard. Anyway, he's not mentioned. Claudius is a big deal throughout the book of Acts. In fact, he's the emperor from the opening of Acts. No, that's not right. Tiberius is the emperor at the opening of Acts. And then Claudius, for all the big journey parts, for that whole section about the journey, that's going to be Claudius. He's going to be the emperor. He'll be important for things like he's the guy, divine irony. He's the guy who's going to issue the decree in 49 that's going to expel all the Jews from Rome. Does anybody know what the side effect of that was? A very important side effect of Claudius, because he hated the Jews, expelling the Jews from Rome. You remember a couple named Priscilla and Aquila in Acts? They had to leave Rome. So they arrived in Corinth just in time for Paul to get there, for him to meet them. They get together and he takes them back to Ephesus on his second journey, where they meet Apollos. They continue his conversion. Apollos goes to Corinth to finish the ministry, to continue the ministry that Paul started, while Paul, who had gone to Jerusalem and Antioch, comes back on his third journey, having never met Apollos, to continue the ministry that Apollos was involved in Ephesus. You just have to step back and admire the artistry of God's divine hand working all that out. On these roads, these beautiful roads that were safe, you could take a tell me when to stop, somebody, but you could take a what have I got here? I don't know. Whoops. I just ended it. Name the movie. Now that I've done that, I'm gonna go find it. While I'm on it. Maps. Let's look at the third journey. So you could take this is Paul's third missionary journey. Look what he did here. Just look at the red line. It's extraordinary. He walked from Antioch. Well, let's start with the second journey. That's the one that matters. I'm a geek for this stuff.
Yeah.
So he walked from Jerusalem to Antioch. I don't know why they're doing that. There's no evidence of that. He's from Tarsus. We'll get back to that. Forbidden to speak the word in Asia. Picks up a boat, and the author of the book of Acts, we'll get to that. Luke is with him at this point. Hitchhikes on a maritime ship because it's safe. You don't have to worry about piracy and bandits and all that sort of thing. Heads across the Aegean to the port city of Philippi, and then proceeds down the coast until he gets kicked out of Philippi, and then gets kicked out of Thessalonica. It's a terrible story. Great response in Berea, we'll get back to all this. But then look at this. He picks up what's called a coastal hugging vessel. These little maritime, the little boys, they would just go up and down the coast to these various ports, back and forth, like a subway almost. And so if you were just a guy, you could book passage on this thing and just head down the coast like a subway. No pun intended with the word subway. And so that's what he did. And then he gets to Athens, and there's that famous story. But then he can once again, this is the port city of Corinth. The major cities were close to the sea, and then they would all have their own port city. Antioch had Seleucia, Ephesus was a port city. Neapolis was for Philippi. You can see how they're set up like this. And so then he heads right straight back across, but he can do this open sea voyage right here. He books passage open sea and that walk all the way around. Because the Roman, what's called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, this 200-year period of stability and prosperity, and safety, security, empire-wide, in the middle of which was enslavement and all sorts of other things. But the unfolding, the birth of the church and its growth all happened in the sweet spot, in my view, not coincidentally, of the Pax Romana. And then there's a language there that everybody knows that can be used to pen the entire New Testament in the same language that can then be compiled together 300 and some odd years later, and then disseminated throughout the Roman Empire in the same way. So it's an amazing. It's just, yeah, you gotta pay attention to the red lines. But once you understand something of the history, in my view, it becomes. It just really opens up the world of the New Testament. Why did they get so small? What time is it?
It is 7:50.
All right. Okay, let's finish some timeline stuff here. Okay. So that's the yellow and green. Really, I couldn't really find a way to make it work. It's really one line. It's the Greco-Roman Empire. Who conquered who? Alexander lasted 13 years, but Greece lasted to today. When you look at our architecture, philosophy, our Senate, we have a Senate. Where do we get the idea of a Senate from? We have a kind of monarch, but he's accountable to the Senate, so to speak. We have a House and a Senate, but all of that is Greco-Roman. They had an emperor, but they had a Senate, and you just couldn't do any. If you were the emperor, you just couldn't do anything you wanted, and if you were the Senate, you just couldn't do anything you wanted. But anyway, this is the period I'll close with. This back to the sort of dead period of biblical writing. The last book of the Old Testament, we think, was written about 400, Malachi, maybe something like that. A lot happened in this period right here. F.F. Bruce wrote a book called New Testament History. He talks a lot about what happened during this period. This is the period in time. If you look in the Old Testament, there's very little mention of things like anything having to do with an afterlife. It's conspicuous by its absence. Resurrection, you have Daniel, a reference in Daniel. You have the enticing psalm that, God will not allow his holy one to undergo decay, which Peter quotes at Pentecost. That's how they understood it. Other than that, I don't know that there's anything that's obvious about resurrection. These people, for them, the covenant wasn't about a promise to go to heaven when they die. The covenant was about a promise to inherit land. Period. End of story. Land, covenant blessings. Not land, covenant curses. Black and white, binary. So here they're back on the land during this period. They don't have a king. They're a vassal state. They have to do whatever the Romans say. They do have their local leaders, which we'll talk about a lot, the chief priests and so forth. But it's not a nation in any sense of the term. There's two parts to it, and they're separated. You have Judea, Samaria, Galilee. Samaria is not Israel. So you have Judea and Galilee separated by this polluted thing in between. It's a great picture of the trauma that these people were experiencing, even though they were back on their land. I can tell you right now, as long as the Samaritans were sitting in the middle of Israel, right smack in the middle of Israel, they were never going to think of themselves as a nation. And if they'd have got the chance, there weren't going to be any Samaritans within the borders of Palestine. They would have done something about that, no question about it. And also, Samaria had more power with the Herods than Judea did. Judea was more of a Caesarea was the administrative capital of Rome in Palestine, is in Samaria. So anyway, back to the sectarianism. So what happened during this period off the land and then back on the land under the Persians is we see the rise of what's called sectarian Judaism, subsets of Judaisms. They're all loyal to Moses, but they have these bitter disagreements with each other about elements. And one of the central elements that they have disagreements with over is the afterlife, the spiritual world. And so one group arises, the Pharisees, who define themselves by their belief in resurrection and an afterlife and angels and spirits and all that sort of thing. And also that the Bible, the sacred scripture, is everything from Genesis to Malachi. The other group, the Sadducees, reject all of that. There is no afterlife, there is no resurrection, there are no angels, there are no spirits, and there are only five. The Torah, the Pentateuch, as we think of it, the first five, that's the holy word, nothing else. And so that was their big disagreement. But they tolerated each other, and they were both in the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, and they would have these debates and so forth. They tolerated each other. And what's going to happen with the resurrection of Jesus is a new sect of Judaism is going to come on the scene in Judea that they're going to call the Nazarenes. And these Nazarenes are like Pharisees on steroids, because they're not only, look, it's one thing to say there's going to be a resurrection someday. It's quite another thing to say, and it just happened, and the one who was resurrected was the promised Messiah who was crucified. So they have this sect of Judaism now that's infecting synagogues all over the empire, eastern half of the empire, teaching this nonsense about a crucified Messiah who was resurrected and vindicated and exalted to the right hand of God, and who now reigns supreme. That's their message. And that's intolerable. They're not going to make way for that. So they had Essenes living on the Dead Sea. You got Pharisees, you have Sadducees, you have these, not really a sect of Judaism, but you have Herodians that are loyal to Herod, aligned with him politically. Then you have these revolutionaries, I forget their names, what they're called. Simon might have been one of them, one of the apostles. They can live with that. Well, they cannot live with these Nazarenes. Nazarene is a pejorative term. It's an insult. That's what they call them in Acts. They're called the Nazarenes. It's an insult. This Jesus, this Nazarene that these people follow, it's crucified. It's crucified Messiah. We'll talk about crucifixion sometimes so you can catch the bite in the idea of crucifixion. But at any rate, that's the important point. Sectarian Judaism wins the day. And now there's a new sect of Judaism, new kid on the block in Israel, and it's not taking no for an answer, and it's not going to be quiet, and it's not going to just disappear. And it's now infecting the Hellenistic synagogues all up through those eastern provinces, Galatia, Macedonia, Asia, Achaia, Cilicia. And we got to do something about this. And that's going to be the story of Acts, or part of the story of that. So the beginning of it, of course, is the birth of the Messiah who was born to die. And you can't, if you're a Jew, you can't get past that thought. You cannot get past the thought of a Messiah who was born to die. That's a contradiction in terms. They'll never get over that. And the disciples will never understand that this side of Jesus' grave, this side of Jesus' resurrection. They will not understand. It is my firm belief that the fact that Jesus' death atoned for sins is known to us because of an act of supernatural revelation given to these men. Because no human being on the face of the planet could have figured out on his own that a man crucified would atone for sins. And they didn't believe that until the resurrection of the dead. Which is why you don't read any of that in the gospel accounts. You read it in letters under the inspiration of the Spirit. And that's when Paul starts talking about this kind of thing. But the Paul, before his conversion, that Paul was going to ever have anything to do with a crucified God, a crucified Messiah. That's blasphemy. That's especially in that period. We'll talk about crucifixion now. what crucifixion meant to those people. We'll do a half an hour on that. What crucifixion, what the act of crucifixion meant in those days. It's more than pain. The shame of it. So that's enough. I think I did all the talking.
That's
So
okay.
hopefully. On the other hand, I got through pretty much everything I wanted to and then some in 1 hour.
Mhm.
So we can just, next week, I'll pepper some stuff in as it goes. So we can start talking about Luke. I don't know how fast you want to go, and go as fast or slow as you want.
So, yeah, I'm flexible. We have 10 weeks scheduled.
Yeah, so when I did Luke, I think I did Luke in 70 weeks. Which is pretty, I know people that do Luke in 10 years, so a year and a half ain't too bad, less than a year and a half.
So
But we don't have to do that either. We can just survey. I thought we were gonna survey the Bible. I was gonna do all of Genesis in one week. You know, we can also go that way, but we'll just see how it goes.
does anybody have an opinion or?
If we get bogged down on it, we'll be here forever.
Yeah.
I'll intro Luke and Acts next time, but I'll give you this. Luke and Acts together is over 25% of the New Testament. So if we do Luke and Acts, by the time we're finished, we'll have studied 25% of them, over 25% of the New Testament.
So here's what I think. We have 10 weeks scheduled. Totally can pick up again in
Yeah.
like January and do more 10 weeks or whatever. But right now, we have 10 weeks.
Yeah.
So what do we want to do with our 10 weeks?
I would want to get to, you can do it either way. We can do all of Luke in 10 weeks. We can do half of Luke in 10 weeks. One chapter a week. That's less than half, but Luke is 24 chapters.
Why don't we shoot for Luke in 10 weeks?
Luke in 10 weeks. What are you gonna do now, Gary? That's 2.5, that's 2.5 chapters a week. So there's your thing. The birth narrative of Jews. Luke 1 and 2.
Unless anybody else has a strong opinion, I'll listen to.
Yeah, we can
whatever
just
you talk
survey.
about.
Really high level paths like this. I mean, in essence, I just did the entire Old Testament in 60 minutes. With no notes.
We skipped all of them.
I did skip all of Kings. Not all of Kings. I told you about
Well,
the
some.
and first Samuel. Well, no, I guess, yeah, first Samuel. No, I guess not. Ruth, gone. Chronicles, gone. None of the Psalms. All right, anyway, then that's what we'll plan on. I don't like doing this thing where you talk about it in such detail. Why does it want me to save changes? Where you talk about it, I wonder what I just threw away. Where you talk about something in such detail that I mean, I know a guy that did Romans in like 10 years. There's a guy in my church that he spent 13 years teaching and he didn't finish James and Ephesians, which is 11 chapters.
My pastor at my home church did Titus 2 for 2 years.
Yeah,
A chapter of Titus 2 in 2 years.
that's not me.
It was miserable. We did, I'm trying to think, when we did the one at FMBA, that was like 3 years. We probably spent half of it on Genesis.